Nikki, Taylor Swift. I know we've been treated like it's the biggest deal in the world ever, but is it?
No.
Before we begin, we've been mind blown away, is what my script says. So we've been we've been mind blown away by the amount of you who are listening to the podcast, and we've been up in the podcast charts and everything, even though I have no grasp of the English language. So we really appreciate you listening in. But we do have a quick favour. We want to keep on going forever and ever and ever because we are officially best friends, actually. And so we kind of have to, or the friendship falls apart. But we need more listeners to keep doing that. So if you can go down into your app, and if you've not subscribed, do that. But then hit share and send us to a couple of friends on WhatsApp or in a text or on, I don't know, Instagram, whatever the kids are using these days. Or post us on social media and just tell them to listen to us so they can find out everything they need to know about the US election, just like you are and you will. Let's get on with it. In our last Friday episode, we pondered whether Trump was losing his mind. And I think we've had some evidence that maybe, yes, he is. There was the debate performance, which we focused on in a bonus episode. Go back and have a listen to that after this, if you haven't already, where he made all sorts of nonsensical claims. But we want to look at some of the other serious claims that he's been making, with one in particular that stood out to us as needing to be taken quite seriously and having some focus upon it. And this was his threat to jail basically all of his opponents if he is to win again. The easiest way to put across what Trump has said is simply by reading it. As we've mentioned before, paraphrasing Trump doesn't really cut the mustard whatsoever, really. It makes it actually sound a little bit better. So, this is what he posted. When I win, these people that cheated will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which will include long-term prison sentences so that this depravity of justice does not happen again. Please beware that this legal exposure extends to lawyers, political operatives, donors, illegal voters, and corrupt election officials. Those involved in unscrupulous behavior will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels, unfortunately, never been seen before in our country. He's got worse grammar than me, Nikki, but quickly, can we just note how utterly outrageous a statement this is? His election theft lie has been proven time and time again to be just that, complete lies, and this targets people who are basically just doing their job in trying to attempt to run democratic processes in America. So this is just completely off the pale outrageous to say, isn't it?
Yeah, and we on this podcast in the last couple weeks have talked about Trump's policy weaknesses, the fact that he doesn't really have a robust policy agenda. The one place where there is a major exception to that is that Trump has spent a lot of time, energy, and resources thinking about how he's going to exact revenge on his political opponents. That tweet, that Truth Social post, that Truth, was a very nice summary of information we've had for a really long time. It was much more explicit than a lot of the past statements he's made. But the reality is that Trump, for years at this point, has been talking about prosecuting members of the Biden family, Hillary Clinton with the lock her up situation, DAs, special counsels, attorneys generals who have been involved in cases against him. And I think you're right, Jarv, to point out that one of the really concerning things here is his targeting of election workers and voters. To be clear, Republicans right now are running this claim that undocumented migrants, people who legally should not be allowed to vote, are not allowed to vote in federal elections, are voting en masse, and that that's influencing the election. It is patently false. The frequency of people who are not allowed to vote actually voting in federal elections is incredibly small. It's even smaller among the number of undocumented people who vote. So a 2016 study found by the Brennan Center found that across 42 jurisdictions, election officials who oversaw the tabulation of 23.5 million votes in the 2016 general election referred only an estimated 30 incidents of suspected non-citizens voting for further investigation or prosecution. In other words, improper non-citizen votes accounted for 0.001% of the 2016 votes in those jurisdictions. It is incredibly rare. It is illegal. Usually, when those cases are referred for prosecution, it turns out that the person made a mistake. But on top of that, Trump and Republicans are not only attempting to create an issue where there is none, they are also saying that they're going to go after election officials. And after 2020, several state attorneys generals who are responsible for running state-level elections reported that they were having an incredibly difficult time finding people who wanted to work as volunteers on election day, poll workers, poll monitors. People who worked in the state attorney general's offices were leaving en masse because in 2020, these people who oftentimes are volunteers who are just doing their civic duty because they think it's important, were subjected to insane harassment, became the subject of absolutely deranged conspiracy theories. When we in our interview that's coming up with Brendan, he mentions the harassment of two poll workers in Georgia, Shay Moss and Ruby Friedman, who won a massive lawsuit against Rudy Giuliani because Giuliani accused them of passing a flash drive containing thousands of votes that supposedly influenced the Georgia election, and they claimed that there was CCTV footage of this flash drive being exchanged. It turned out that the object that had been handed between the two women was a piece of candy, and they won a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Giuliani. But these women were harassed, threatened with death, forced to leave their homes, and they were just volunteers. So for Trump, 55 days out of an election, to be putting a spotlight on people like this, it's not only based on irresponsible and false information, it's also incredibly dangerous because we have seen real-world targeting of these people. And it's infuriating because early voting has just started in several states, and Trump is already spreading conspiracies claiming that this election is fraudulent.
It's one of the other weird things, I suppose, Nikki, here too, just to bounce off what you were saying there, is that Trump is constantly saying there's loads of problems in the country. Why does he keep then just making new ones up? That's the thing I find the most strange, is why can't he just rally against the actual stuff that he says Harris is fucking up, instead of him just being like, oh, and there's this thing, which is just not really an actual issue. It just seems really, really odd to me, this level of derangement there. I mean, Chris, is that kind of it, though, as well, is that Trump, it does feel like at points in the past, has made lies like this up or exaggerated things, but does it feel to you maybe like he's starting to believe his own story he's making up?
I mean, that we can say they're lies because they are lies, but I think there's part of this, a massive part of this, that is just him believing these things are true or just flat out denial. We saw that in the presidential debate that happened this week. There was lie after lie, and we didn't actually, I don't think, get to the biggest one. Was the fact that he said he was asked if he regretted his actions on January 6th, and his response was that I had nothing to do with that. That was his words. And obviously, we know he had a lot to do with that. He asked his followers at the speech to make their way to the Capitol building. To me, that is having something to do with it. But as I say, he's in complete denial about his actions over these things, and has been in denial so much that he actually believes that he has done no wrong and can do no wrong and tell no lies, essentially. And that whole, as Nikki says, the lies and the denial around election fraud, I think is the biggest of all. And if he wasn't in that mindset, we wouldn't see this absolute I guess, circus of a revenge tour that we're seeing now.
It's one of the other things, though, as well. Republicans do just seem to trust him far more than we might expect.
Yeah, although I would say I think we already know how much a lot of Republicans trust Trump. But you're right, there is some polling out here that suggests how loyal a lot of Republicans are to Trump. And this comes from AP Nork, which suggests this, and I'll read it out. More Republicans trust Trump and his campaign, 67%, than government certifications on election results, 51%, for accurate information on the outcome of the November election. And that is a big concern because, as we say, Trump loves to deny anything wrong that has happened to him. For example, again, the debate. He's come out since and said that the debate was rigged and that ABC should lose its license, which is a ridiculous thing to say. He just lost the debate. He should just accept that. But because so many people trust him and trust everything that he says, if we get to a situation where Trump loses this election, he's obviously going to say that it was rigged and that this election is false again. And then the concern is, what do those people do who trust Trump with their lives? What do they go out and do? That's a massive concern.
My favorite thing about Trump on the whole rigged thing was when he said, I was debunked so many times in the debate. And it's like, well, if you were debunked, then you were debunked. That's fair enough. That means what you were saying was in fact wrong.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nikki, you were coming in there.
Yeah, I want to add here that these claims about voter fraud in elections do have a political end goal for Republicans. They make it much easier for the GOP to push for legislation that restricts voter rights. Right now in Congress, there is a lot of debate over the SAVE Act, which in short, would require Americans to present proof of citizenship when they register to vote, either a passport or a birth certificate. Only about half of Americans have a passport on hand. If you live in the United States and you've ever, had to get a passport, it's a super long process. It takes weeks, if not months sometimes. It costs a ton of money. Getting a birth certificate, also, it's a whole process. You got to wait weeks for it. You got to pay for it. Those kinds of things, implementing those laws that make it harder that make it harder for people to register to vote, to participate in elections.
Yeah.
Those laws statistically benefit Republicans. So that is also another reason why they keep pushing this lie, because it is good for them electorally to weaponize claims of voter fraud.
Well, is that practically as well the point of this? Is we can, because sometimes I worry about giving too much voice to the things that Trump says. But with this, as you say, it's a voter suppression technique, whether that be that he makes it, as you say, if poll workers can't turn up, or poll workers don't want to turn up, or there's less poll stations, all that sort of thing. That's his new roll of the dice, isn't it? Is basically the only way he can win is if significantly less people vote, it would appear. Is that the practical upside of what he's trying to do here?
Yeah, 100%. And we've seen throughout the country that some state governors have also weaponized these claims of voter fraud to target communities within their own state. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis started an election security task force that has been going around arresting people who are accused of voter fraud. And it's no coincidence that the majority of the people who are being targeted by this task force are Black and of minority communities. It's fundamentally a cover to increase Republicans' hold on political power. And again, our institutions are in so many ways incredibly weak. And if Trump and Republicans come into power in November, we're going to see a vast reshaping of not only our governmental institutions, but our electoral processes.
Nikki, there was another pretty shocking thing that Trump said in the last few days, essentially where he was speaking. He was at a campaign rally in Wisconsin, in where you are now, although I assume it's a big place, so I don't know if you know where the rally was. But he basically was speaking about this plan he has, which seems like his new sort of version of building the wall. Now he's doing this whole, I'm going to deport every single migrant I can, essentially. And he said that it will be a bloody story.
Yeah.
Which just seems absolutely, ludicrous to me. Is this, it can be seen as pandering to his base at one point, but also, do we have to look at this seriously and kind of take him at his word? If he's saying he's going to try and do stuff, this is the indication of what he wants to do when he's in office.
No, we absolutely have to take it seriously. Stephen Miller, who was one of his primary advisors on immigration during his first administration, has created incredibly detailed plans about how they're going to carry out these mass deportations. And all of the rhetoric we're seeing from the GOP surrounding immigration, surrounding the horrendous, vile stories they're concocting about Haitian migrants, the mythical migrant crime wave they've been espousing and harping on about, those are all tactics to normalize repressive violence against these communities. That's not anything that's taking place without an end goal. And the end goal here is to normalize the use of intense, brutal force against these communities, to deport them en masse, to imprison them. There has been talk from members of Trump's inner circle about the creation of what are essentially concentration camps to house migrants awaiting deportation. And the fact, I think it's also important to remember that the GOP line on immigrants and immigration has already gotten bloody. We have seen in repeated instances mass shootings targeting migrant communities, communities of colors, that the shooters themselves have indicated were directly fueled and motivated by the rhetoric being espoused by the GOP. It is already bloody.
Well,
so for Trump to just come out and admit it, well, yeah, that's exactly what it's going to be.
Well, all you need to do to prove what Nikki has just said there is look at the first line of the platform/manifesto of the GOP, and that is seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. It's weaponized language that is designed to create division among society in the US. But it's also, and I've talked about this before, this kind of language which Trump uses, he uses the word siege, invasion, and bloody. He uses all of these emotive words. And it's all a form of dominance politics, as I've mentioned before. I spoke to Professor Stephen Fish about this on our sister podcast, The Bunker. And this is one of Trump's biggest assets, to use this type of language, because it's what his base, as you've rightly pointed out, it's what his base want to hear from him. It's ruthless, but there's also an element of entertainment to it as well.
I think the thing I always find startling as well, I spoke to, again, a conversation on the Bunker podcast, another very good podcast, but keep listening to this one, where I spoke to Jonathan Blitzer about, he wrote a great book around migration, and in that I quoted George W. Bush, who in 2006 made a speech from the Oval Office where he said, "We're a nation of laws and we must enforce our laws. We're also a nation of immigrants and we must uphold that tradition, which has strengthened our country in so many ways. These are not contradictory goals." That speech was only made 18 years ago. I know a lot of things have changed in 18 years, but I'm sure all of us probably don't really settle politically on being very aligned with George W. Bush, but the Republican Party has gone from that, it's gone from that to this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I'm no George W., but that is just startling that was the Republican line not that long ago.
The point that we're making here is that there has been a big step in terms of the rhetoric over immigration from then to now. And mentioning the Bunker again, actually, I spoke to Peter Wehner, who is a former member of George W. Bush's administration. And he talks about how the GOP has had a darkness over it since Trump has risen to power. And the rhetoric around immigration is such a massive example of that.
Nikki, I mean, how do you think? Because one thing I find really hard with Trump is keeping this focus on that it's like the things he's saying are really fucked up, and it has to be focused on really seriously. And then a lot of the media does seem to just treat him like the old man shouts at cloud meme, or they try and make him sound more sensible or whatever, or they just kind of make these things seem flippant. I mean, how do you think we separate the nonsense from the actual threats and stay focused on that?
I think it's a very difficult line to walk because part of, and we've talked about this before, but part of the reason he does have such an appeal is because throughout his career, he's had that charisma, that sort of presence that is very attractive to the evangelical base, to his vote, to the voters that have become incredibly devoted to him. And I think throughout the last 9 years, the media has never really figured out how to handle Donald Trump. They've never been able to break out of the coverage styles and sort of the norms and expectations that were built around decades of politicians who, in many ways, held a lot of the same views as the former president, but were able to communicate that in like thinly veiled dog whistles and through campaigns of repression and targeting that were much more sort of like clouded in this veneer of respectability. And to be clear, the like media in the United States has been laundering Republican talking points as like valid policy for decades. It's not new with Trump. It's now the thing that has changed is that Trump has made it explicit. He does not give a shit about disguising his plans in respectability politics. And I think journalists, reporters, commentators, you have to treat it seriously. And I think a lot of people do. But I think, in my opinion, there needs to be less time spent focusing on sort of like the meandering, rambling, the late great Hannibal Lecter thing, and more emphasis on how dangerous and destructive these policies are going to be. And that's not to say that the emphasis isn't there, because there are fantastic reporters who work overtime to expose the depth of things like Project 2025 and Agenda 47. But the consensus across the industry has not been established. And, you know, the election is in 55 days as of Thursday. It's not, that switch is not going to flip in time.
Donald Trump, yes, him again. He's taken aim at winning over black voters in this election, but his weird racist outburst in an interview with the National Association of Black Journalists in August, where he claimed that Kamala Harris turned black, amongst other strange and untrue rants, may have undone a lot of his campaign's work to do that.
Data from the Pew Research Center shows that although black voters are much more likely to vote Democratic, their support for the party has waned over the last 4 years. Joining us to discuss how key black voters are in this election, what matters most to them up and down the country, and the challenges Kamala Harris faces as a black woman on the presidential ticket is national politics reporter for Capital B, Brandon Tensley. Hi, Brandon.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Brandon. Let's get this out of the way quickly. The debate was on Tuesday. What were your key takeaways from that?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I was sort of watching the debate through closed fingers, at least in my mind, because I was also writing about it.
Yeah.
But I think we saw that Kamala Harris was able to do what Joe Biden was not able to do, which is to really just know how to respond effectively to someone like Trump, who will ramble off on tangents that don't make sense, who will just sort of distract from the conversation. And I think she was able to, even if she wasn't talking as much, I think the Washington Post tallied how much each person was talking, even though she talked less than Donald Trump. I think it was because, one, she had him on the defensive, and so he wanted to respond to a lot of things that she was saying, but also she talked a lot with her face, as a lot of the memes afterward made. So I think, that was as good of a debate as Democrats could hope for.
Right, that's out of the way now, and I promise listeners we'll stop talking about the debate as soon as we can. Let's get to the
No, we
matter
won't.
at Let's get to the matter at hand here, though. In terms of black communities and black voters, I think it's around about 14% of the total overall electorate that black voters take up in the US. So that's a pretty key chunk, and we're talking about an election here that is going to be won by fine margins. So, what are the key issues at play here as far as black voters are concerned?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that come up, through my reporting, through national surveys, national polling, they're issues that I think a lot of other Americans care about, right?
Yeah.
It's probably just more acute among Black Americans, Black voters. So housing, you hear housing a lot, the cost of housing, rent. This is one thing that Kamala Harris has talked about a lot on the campaign trail since late July, is, how do we help first-time renters? How do we help people who are first-time homeowners? How do we help people who want that sort of, want to have the financial security available to build generational wealth? So definitely housing, the cost of living, the like drugs, medications, groceries, gas, all those sorts of things. I would say to me, this is particularly striking in terms of issues that the way that it's framed that Black voters care about is safety for their communities. And it's not just, safety in terms of safety from gun violence, but it's also safety against white supremacy. This is something that we've seen come up in some surveys, is safety from the kind of the white nationalism that we've seen, especially since 2016, but wanting to feel safe, not only in their communities, but when we go to a polling station, what would be confronted with somebody who, has a gun, these, quote unquote poll monitors.
Yeah.
But I would say those are, some of the key issues that Black voters are concerned about.
And just on that white supremacy point, do you think that this is that white kind of evangelical base is something that Trump really targets, and that's a key part of his voter base? When he panders to the likes of the Proud Boys, for example, how much damage does that therefore do to black communities that perhaps wanted to vote for Trump, but see that he agrees with points made by groups like this? Does that completely just change their mind, or does it take a lot more than that for black communities, for example, that are Republican to just switch completely?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because, I think you're getting at sort of different strands of Black conservatism, right?
Right.
I think you have some Black conservative voters, Black Republicans who are going to turn out for Trump no matter what. But I think those people who are, maybe socially conservative, those Black voters who are socially conservative, who might actually be open to hearing some of the policies that Trump has to talk about. But then when he turns around and, he sort of endorses this kind of white ethno-nationalism, he talks about wanting to exact revenge against his opponents. Those are the sorts of things that I think will then make those Black voters who, might have at least given him a shot, might have at least listened to what he had to say. It turns them off.
Yeah, and sticking with this kind of theme, Kamala Harris has seen, I guess, countless attacks from the GOP, including Trump, on the color of her skin, to put it bluntly. And I was looking through your work, and you'd written an article that was headlined "Harris, like Obama, must defend her identity along with her policy positions." Now, we've spoken a lot about her policy positions on this podcast, and basically we think that she needs to be clearer, although the debate showed her being a bit clearer on where she stands in terms of policy. But in terms of defending her identity, what kind of attacks has she come under? And do you think she's done a good job of hitting back at those attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question because I think her approach to it is really different from, I think, what people might expect. So, I would say like maybe the most obvious attack that she's faced from the American right when it comes to her identity is the birther claims, right? The idea that because she had her mother was Indian, her father's Jamaican, that she is not an American citizen, she's not eligible to even have a campaign for the White House, and those are that's like playbook from when Obama was running as well, right? And so I think that is one thing that we've seen her come up against in terms of her racial identity, and her response, honestly, has been to both sort of shut down the conversation, shut down the criticism, and then sort of pivot. Sort of say, we've heard her say on the campaign trail multiple times now, it's some version of it's the same old tired playbook. It's leaning into this sort of like grievance politics. And then she like moves on to like the next question. And I think a lot of people I've been talking to for stories, from voters to analysts, have said that this is actually like an effective approach because it prevents Donald Trump from being able to sort of hijack the conversation, this sort of like ugly race to the bottom with like personal attacks that he, you know, seems to enjoy, I think partly because it plays really well to his base. And so I think she's taken away a lot of like air from that conversation by just not engaging with it on those terms.
Yeah, no, I think the way she's handled those attacks has been absolutely fascinating, particularly the strategy she's adopted of simply not giving Trump the in, not like engaging with him. And I think we saw that as well in the debate where, as you said, he was responding to her and she was just doing her own thing. But I want to pivot a bit to some of the more systemic issues that are facing Black communities when it comes to voting. I don't think it's a far stretch to say that historically Black communities have been more aligned with the Democratic Party, and that has inherently made them the target of efforts by the GOP to restrict or decrease voter participation. Right now, with the August recess over, we are seeing that Republicans are attempting to pass the SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship to register to vote. Could you walk our audience through how these sort of historic forces have shaped the political identities of Black Americans, the way they participate in elections, and the way they engage with politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you noted, like really since, I would say like the 1960s is really that sort of like watershed moment. We have the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We have the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And so we have the Democratic Party really sort of taking up the mantle as, as someone put it to me one time, the party for Black people. And so I think that sort of institutional relationship is really what has kept many Black voters tied to the Democratic Party. In addition to the fact that the Republican Party, I think really after the 1960s, sort of saw winning over Black voters as kind of a losing battle. And so, the way that I often sort of have talked about this with sources is, whenever the Republican Party is really making these sorts of supposed appeals to Black communities, I would argue that these are less about appealing to Black communities and they're about appealing to white voters, white conservative voters who might have some reservations about voting for a party that has this very contentious past and present sort of relationship with Black voters. It makes them feel better, basically, about voting for a party that honestly has these really sort of odious policy propositions for Black communities. And so these appeals really aren't for Black voters who can look at the, Project 2025 has been, an obvious talking point in recent months, but really looking at these policy proposals and these policy visions and how they just do not include the rights, the dignity, the well-being of Black voters in those visions. And so I think it's really navigating this tightrope of saying you're talking to Black voters, but you're really trying to just address and assuage sort of criticisms of racism and not really do the work of bringing Black voters into the Republican Party.
And as we noted in the intro, we have seen a little bit of a shift in sort of the party split over the last couple of years, particularly among Black men who seem to be a little bit more favorable toward the Republican Party in recent years. I'm wondering how you would explain that shift.
Yeah, I think I would almost sort of always preface this with, what people say sort of pre-election doesn't necessarily determine what's going to happen on election day. Because I think even though you see these higher than normal sort of numbers that show Black voter support for the Republican Party, I think one thing that has come up a lot in my conversations is the most Trump can really probably expect to win, Black voter support wise on election day is, at most probably like 11 or 12%, which would put it back into the norm of what the Republican Party has gotten in elections. And so, I think there was this lack of enthusiasm for Joe Biden that was beneficial to Donald Trump that could explain some of that sort of openness that we saw among Black male voters in particular with Donald Trump, and his sort of talking about economic policies, small business ownership, those sorts of things that tend to resonate with certain parts of the Black community. But, I think, once we actually get to November, once we get to election day, I would be very surprised if a lot of these, seeming swings in Black voter support actually happen in reality.
You mentioned Biden there, and the change that we saw nationally, really, from everyone in the enthusiasm for the election. But amongst Black communities, from your reporting, from what you've seen, how much of a change is there now that Harris is on the ticket? I imagine it's someone that they can see and identify as being similar to themselves, really. Someone that understands their struggles and their hardships, and someone that's going to get behind them whilst in office. So, what would you say is the biggest change that you've seen from Black communities, and how much more enthusiasm is there now?
But I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, I think the biggest change is 100% enthusiasm. And so I think it was less in enthusiasm to turn out, right?
Yeah.
I think when you talk to a lot of Black organizers, their concern was less that there was going to be a kind of political realignment where all of a sudden most Black voters or this meaningful sort of number of Black voters would support the Republican Party. And it was whether Black voters feel enthusiastic enough about the Democratic nominee to actually, do what unfortunately takes a lot of work to actually go out to the polls and vote. And so I think that enthusiasm and how it affects voter turnout was like the biggest concern. And I think that is from what I've heard from Black organizers, that is the biggest change that they have seen since Kamala Harris has taken over at the top of the ticket is like, we're struggling less with, voter apathy sort of broadly construed. And it's about like, okay, cool. There seems to be excitement, enthusiasm that was not there even a couple of months ago. And now how do we actually sort of turn that excitement, that enthusiasm into actual votes on election day?
As you said, like the enthusiasm gap is going to be probably the biggest definer of this election, particularly in some critical swing states, one of which is Georgia, where Black voters hold an immense amount of political power. And we've already seen that both the Harris and the Trump campaign are spending a lot of time there. Obviously, it's the same state where Trump is currently under indictment for attempting to interfere with the 2020 election, attempting to overturn the results in that state. Do you feel that the aftermath of the 2020 election has had an impact in Georgia? This also may be like way too specific of a question, but it's one of the things I've been considering is like this dynamic where Trump is making a play for Black voters in this state where he is under indictment by a Black DA who he has attacked in horrendous ways, if that's having a ground impact in terms of how close that state is right now.
I think that is having an impact. The fact that he's under, he's facing an indictment, and also the fact, and I've been reporting out a story on this over the past couple of months. Is also just those really heartbreaking testimonies that we saw from Black poll workers that have really just sort of like brought race to the fore in a way that, I mean, we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about sort
Yeah.
of the Atlanta metro area, that's always had like a significant Black political presence. Um, but the way that it's been brought out in a way that is decidedly not favorable to Trump, when we saw a lot of his allies sort of harassing and abusing Black poll
Shay Moss
workers,
and
right?
Ruby Friedman. Yeah.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And so I think that is something that uh, affects the election, specifically in Georgia. Because to your point, right? Like the election will be decided in a lot of these swing states, right? And so
Yeah.
when we're talking about enthusiasm, when we're talking about, how do we get these key Democratic constituencies to turn out, I mean, all votes matter. But in
Yeah.
terms of like how
Yes.
votes will decide elections, Black turnout in New York isn't going to be as significant in terms of determining the election as, Black voters in Georgia, in
Yeah.
Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in all these like
Yeah.
swing states where we're seeing a lot of these different legal battles to affect, voting procedures and policies. But yeah, anyway, to answer your question, yeah, I
Yeah.
absolutely do think that is weighing on Black voters in Georgia.
I'm gonna make Chris mad here, and I want to pull it back to the debate. Sorry, Chris, but obviously there are Black communities in the United States that have lived and existed here for centuries, but there are also more recent diasporic communities who are first generation immigrants, the children of first generation immigrants. And one of those is the Haitian community, which has a major presence in states like Florida, in New York. And obviously, right now, we are embroiled in coverage of an incredibly racist smear against Haitian migrants by the president, by his vice president, by Republicans at large. And I would like to talk a little bit about how that's affecting these sort of diasporic communities, how that sort of rhetoric this close to an election could tip that scale, because frankly, I'll just leave it there. It's so upsetting to me. I was talking to friends about this, and I'm like, I can't remember like this awful of like a right-wing panic since the like Ground Zero mosque in the early
Mhm.
2000s. It's just disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's vile. I think it's the sort of rhetoric that can directly affect people's well-being, right? Like
Mm,
people's actual safety. I think as reporters, as journalists, it's easy to sort of like become the target of, maybe you write something and just like the wrong people on right-wing
yeah.
Twitter see it, and you become a target for like, maybe a couple days. It sucks. But I think when we're talking about the Republican Party standard bearers perpetuating these racist, xenophobic smears against Black immigrant communities, that is not just a vile lie. It is also physically dangerous, I think, to the communities in these different areas. And in terms of like the election, I think that is, actually similar to what I was saying earlier, where you know it's signaling, I would say, more toward the right wing base, right? Like you're sort of
Yeah.
like throwing out all these different kinds of smears, this kind of like baiting to get people sort of like riled up as a sort of mobilization mechanism, right? For your base. And you're doing it 1,000% at the expense of the livelihoods, the safety of these already vulnerable communities.
Yeah, and we're recording on Thursday, but today there were reports for our listeners of a bomb threat against the city hall in Springfield, Ohio, and other reports about Haitian families who are, having their houses vandalized, having to keep their children home from school because they're afraid for their safety. So it's an awful developing situation, and like the fear now after that bomb threat is that this will result in like actual violence against this vulnerable community.
Mhm.
Yeah, Trump and the GOP and their messaging around immigration and just not treating people like people. They have a lot to answer for. Brandon, you're an absolute legend. Thanks for joining us on American Friction.
Thank you for having me.
Right, rounding up some other stories that you might have missed. But this is one I imagine barely anyone in the world has missed. Nikki, Taylor Swift. She has come out and firmly backed Kamala Harris. How big a deal is that? Because I know we've been treated like it's the biggest deal in the world ever, but is it?
No, I don't think so. No,
Fair.
I mean, it's a good get when you have a celebrity of that magnitude endorse a campaign. It's a good get. And I don't want to downplay the significance of the fact that I think vote.org, which is a website that helps people register to vote, reported something like 300,000 visits in like the 24 hours after Taylor Swift released her Instagram post. I think that was converted to about maybe like 15,000 new voter registrations, which is really good and really important. And what I will say is that the endorsement, likely among young women, the parents of young women who are big Taylor Swift fans, that might give a bump in terms of enthusiasm, in terms of people who are like, oh, I really want to go vote. I want to get registered to vote. But it's nowhere near enough to cover the wide scale mobilization that needs to take place in order for Harris to win this election. It's, it's a good campaign. It's a good get for the campaign, but it's not, for example, a commitment from Swift to be a spokesperson, to appear at events. It's just her coming out and saying, I'm going to vote for Harris.
Is it, if nothing else, though, I mean, is the bigger upside politically maybe just how upset it has made Donald Trump and Donald Trump's allies? Because they just look really, really silly, to be honest, the way that they're trying to push back on this, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to rewind a little bit here to January of 2024 and the end of the 2023 NFL season, when Republicans were floating conspiracy theories that Taylor Swift's relationship with Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs was actually just a deep state conspiracy so that the Chiefs would win the Super Bowl and then Taylor Swift would endorse Joe Biden and win them the election. And from that point onward, Taylor Swift's politics have been a bit of a point of obsession for Republicans. Rolling
They just
Stone
can't
had a
shake it
report-
off.
Yes, you gotta shake
Perfect
it
delivery
off.
from me there. I was waiting for it. It came and I pounced.
Thanks, Chris.
But we had a report in Rolling Stone a couple months ago about how Trump was telling his advisors that if Swift endorsed Biden, he would declare holy war against her. And now that she's endorsed Harris, he's, saying, oh, I don't actually care. It doesn't matter to me. But it's like, dude, you very clearly do care.
Yeah, it was. I mean, one of my favorite weird reactions to this was Newsmax host Greg Kelly, who is saying, "Oh, they're elevating her to an idolatry. This is a little bit of what idolatry, I think, looks like, and you're not supposed to do that. In fact, if you look it up in the Bible, it's a sin." Greg Kelly, though, did say it's beautiful and blessed that Donald Trump is selling Bibles. Not very long ago.
Right.
That was in Media Matters for America there. And yeah, so this Greg Kelly, I would say, has been idolizing Trump quite a bit. So the sort of
entire
hypocrisy
Republican
there.
Party.
Exactly. And then this one, Jack Posobiec, who is, really gross. But Taylor Swift is a deep state psyop. But it's okay. We don't have Taylor Swift on our side, but you know who we have? We have Kid Rock. We have Ted Nugent. We have influencers. We have all these people. John Voight.
Wow.
And you just think,
look
okay.
at all those C-list celebrities.
I don't know who Ted Nugent is, and John Voight feels like a really old school get. And
yeah, no,
then,
it's not relevant. But
then they
also,
just...
for our listeners, important to clarify here that Jack Posobiec is the guy who invented the Pizzagate conspiracy. So...
Yeah, I mean, and then on, gross conspiracy theory people here, Dave Rubin, this is the other thing that's just been where they've either made themselves look stupid or incredibly gross. So Elon Musk's tweet about Taylor Swift was just really, really gross. About Taylor Swift with his whole, I'll give you a baby. But then Dave Rubin, though, this was one that I found which was like, I was like, this is just, these guys are being really gross. He said, Taylor Swift should reconsider her endorsement of VP Harris. And he said, Taylor Swift, you're a young, pretty girl. Do you know what the gang members from Venezuela do to young, pretty girls? And you just think, how do these people show themselves up so much? They've been like, we're not weird. And then they've been like, oh, we don't even care about Taylor Swift. We've got John Voight. And then they make these pretty disgusting kind of threats towards her. And you just think, how do you possibly think this works? So I agree with you, Nikki, that maybe in terms of voter motivation in some ways it doesn't work. But one thing it's quite good at, and we've said this, is how the right wing will drag themselves out to look awful completely unprompted. Like when Tim Walz's son was crying and then they started just tearing this kid to shreds. And you just think, you really are happy, all of you, to make yourselves look like the biggest pieces of shit in the entire world with no one even telling you to. And I think that seems to be a bit of the benefit of getting Taylor Swift on board to me.
And I think part of the reason they are that way is because Taylor Swift does represent everything that they think a woman should not be allowed to be. And their response to that is the threat of sexual violence.
Yeah.
She's a successful 30-something-year-old woman who's decided not to have kids, who is living her life completely independently on her own terms. And again, to talk about, the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, when she was in the middle of the Eras tour, started a very high-profile relationship with an NFL star, and where the NFL is seen as like, oh, boy time, man realm. There a lot of
nice
boy time. But a lot of right-wingers' response to that was to create AI-generated images of Swift being assaulted. And it was disgusting and vitriolic, and it just goes to show that oftentimes when Republicans encounter a woman they disagree with, their immediate response is to attack her sex and to make her fear for her sexual safety. It's kind of the same thing that they've done to Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Where they regularly make jokes and thinly veiled allusions to sexual assault and like blowjobs and things like that. And it's really disgusting. And again, like you said, it just shows that they're weird and not normal and don't know how to engage with regular people.
On the other side, then, let's look at a couple of things from the Democrats. And something that I'm finding quite strange is there does seem to be, like, the campaign from both ends is running off of vibes, and just the Democrats have been able to go, we're obviously good vibes versus those guys, and that seems to be working out for them a bit. But Joe Biden, he's really, he seems to be taking to his new kind of backseat role campaign-wise pretty well. He was wearing a MAGA hat the other day when he was speaking to someone. Is that a good move? What's going on there? Why is he putting on a little MAGA hat?
It baffles me. It baffles me. Like, why would you do that in front of a room of people with cameras on their phone and reporters? Like, thank God this man is no longer the candidate. Like, oh my God.
He is still president, though.
Yeah.
He is still president, but he's not running for re-election. So, go to bed, Grandpa. No, just like, what were they thinking? Why did one of his aides not just like snatch it out of his hands? I don't know. It baffles me. Can you imagine Trump putting on like a Harris Waltz hat?
Yeah. I kind of, it's weird because I agree. On my first looking at it, I thought this is so stupid. But then on the second, thought, I was like, is he just kind of showing how silly he thinks those people are? And you could AI generate him in a MAGA hat or whatever, I guess, anyway. I don't know. Do you think it's just own goal territory all the way?
Yeah, 100%.
He's obviously just trying to be funny, and it's just not landed.
Yeah, fair.
I
know
if
that
anything,
feels.
it's a bit insensitive.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's very funny. It was a bit unnecessary.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, talking about someone who's pretty unnecessary, Marjorie Taylor Greene. But
Mentioned
Marjorie
her in a
Taylor
while.
Greene, we haven't mentioned her in a little while. I know we
Bring
have
back the
Marjorie Taylor.
bells.
Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't been listening to us for a long time, hello. We used to speak about Marjorie Taylor Greene more often, and Simon put in a little sound effect for her. But anyway, so she's actually, though, kind of done something. I don't want to give her credit, but she is pushing back. Someone's gone too far for Marjorie Taylor Greene. What is this split in MAGA worlds, Nikki? Because it seems I didn't think there was too far for Marjorie Taylor Greene, but apparently Laura Loomer has gone too far.
Okay. Jesus, these are like two of my least favorite people. And
Yeah.
in a way, it's extremely let them fight, let them destroy each other. I don't mind. But Laura Loomer, for those who don't know, is a Trump fanatic conspiracy theorist who became really prominent during Trump's first administration as like a viral online self-declared Islamophobe who was tweeting some of the most racist things you've ever seen. And she kind of came into the mainstream consciousness after she got banned from Twitter and handcuffed herself to the doors of Twitter's headquarters in San Francisco.
That's
This
a
was
normal-
before
that's a normal
Musk had
thing
bought
to
the
do.
company. Yeah, no, totally
Yeah.
normal thing to do. And she like, when she did it, she put on a Star of David like she was a victim of the Holocaust and claimed that she had been banned because she was Jewish. She was not banned because she was Jewish. She was banned because she was a virulent racist. And over the years, it's become pretty clear that she and Trump are actually friends. We have reporting in Rolling Stone that, well, the New York Times reported last year that Trump was trying to find a place for her in his re-election campaign. We at Rolling Stone then got reporting from sources in Trump's like immediate orbit saying absolutely the fuck not. We want nothing to do with this woman. But regardless of not having an official role, she continues to be a major advocate for Trump, continues to be extremely racist online. She was reinstated to Twitter after Elon Musk bought it. And what the conflagration of all this is that this week, when Trump arrived in Philadelphia for the debate on Tuesday, Laura Loomer was on the plane with him. She exited the plane on the tarmac a little bit after he did. So she accompanied him to the debate. And then on Wednesday, which was 9/11, she accompanied Trump to a 9/11 memorial ceremony in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And people got very upset because Loomer has previously tweeted out 9/11 conspiracy theories. Last week, she tweeted out, or sorry, not last week, last year, she wrote a post that included a video with a giant text screen that said 9/11 was an inside job. So it was like, it is incredibly disrespectful to the families of the victims who are being memorialized that day to bring a 9/11 conspiracy theorist to the memorial service. That was not what Marjorie Taylor Greene took issue with, funnily enough.
That none of that crossed the line. That's the thing.
None of that crossed the line.
We now
What
know
happened?
Marjorie Taylor Greene's line, and none of them are it.
Well, Marjorie herself is a pretty avowed conspiracy theorist, has said some really awful things, but on Wednesday night, she disavowed a tweet from Loomer in which Loomer said that if Kamala Harris won, the White House would smell like curry because Harris is Indian. And vile, disgusting tweet, but Greene essentially responded with, this is extremely racist. This has no place in the MAGA movement. Loomer does not represent us and what we stand for. And then Loomer responded with just like a string of incredibly salacious allegations against Greene. Did not provide evidence for a lot of them. She suggested that Marjorie Taylor Greene uses the N-word in private. She called out Greene for the affairs she had that resulted in the end of her marriage. Said a bunch of other stuff, and now the two are just like really openly fighting. But electorally, the big concern here, and we're seeing reporting from people who are in Trump's orbit, is that Loomer is getting close to President Trump, and she is influencing him in a way that's negatively impacting the campaign. As we talked about in the debate recap episode, Trump's advisors had told him, do not mention the cat eating story on the debate stage. And some reporting came out on Wednesday that on the plane ride together, Loomer had been egging him on about the cat misinformation thing.
Well, yeah, Nikki, I suppose this is kind of, did it show a bit of the depth of the depravity within the Republican Party, but also show there are clearly some people who are extremists, but saying these things in a somewhat performative way. But then there are other people who are just unabashedly like there is no bottom to where they will stoop because their views are just off the scale. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, I considered someone whose views fell off the scale, but clearly part of it is a bit of almost an act to an extent. And then there are some people who it's like, no way, they're 100% off the deep end.
Fully. You're completely correct. And I think the bigger point here is that there is a constant battle for influence over Trump. We know throughout his political career that often the person he listens to is the last person he spoke to. Greene, for a long time, held that position of influence. So it's not just about the party trying to control the narrative about how they present a lot of this sort of like vile rhetoric, these racist claims about accusations against Harris, who oftentimes they disguise as dog whistles. It's also about who gets to have the ear of the former president, who is allowed into the room. And I think for a lot of Republicans, Loomer is a step too far because she is so explicit in her racism and her extremism.
Some might say there's a bit of bad blood within the GOP.
All right, there we go.
They might.
You did it.
We've been mind blown away